Hey, today we're going to be talking about buying out a tenant, particularly if you are in a tenant-friendly state, like I am. I'm in DC. Tenant-friendly would also mean New York, California. These tricks can work in any state. Buying them out, cash for keys, however you want to call it, but we'll call it buying it out, same concept. I have 5 tips that I use. I have had to buy out 2 tenants in the past, and hopefully never again in the future. But it just comes with the territory. I'm also an attorney, but again, anyone can use these 5 tips. All right, the first one: building rapport. So generally, when you reach this point where you're going to buy out a tenant, you guys are probably not on the best terms. They probably owe you rent money, or they're in severe breach of your lease where you just want to evict them, and you're like, oh, to evict them is probably going to take a long time. I'm going to miss out on rent. Let me just pretty much throw money at the problem and buy them out. My first tenant, we were not on the best terms. That's a different story for a different day. She set my house on fire. But anyways, the second tenant, we also were not on the best terms. There was just tension, and it was more of a breach of the lease. And I knew he also was having a financial difficulty. He would not be able to pay the rent. So I had to work when I would stop by the property. I would just ask him about him, like, how are you doing? How are your kids doing? I try to really soften him up, soften up the situation. There were times he was going high, and I was like, okay, you got to go low. Just go low. Don't go high with him. And leading up to this point, I was matching his energy. So build rapport. Be on good terms. Because if you're not, the next 4 steps they're just not going to work. They're not going to work. No one wants to negotiate with someone who they want to bite their head off. It's just not going to work. Okay. The second step is have a number in mind. Have a number in mind. What is the highest you are willing to, what's the most money you're willing to give, right? Just have it in your mind. Of course, when you start negotiating, which we'll get to, you want to start low, but just have your number in mind. And again, the number does not necessarily have to be a number. Like for me, it ended up being money, and then also I offered up I'll pay for moving expenses for someone, a friend who's also a landlord. He ended up giving money, and he also, one of his tenants, I think he bought out like 3 tenants, but one of his tenants didn't speak English that well, and he was like, hey, I'll help you fill out applications for the next place you move into, right? Or I'll help you fill out other pretty much applications to apply to another unit. Right? So that was a part of buying them out, right? So have your number in mind. For my first tenant, the first time I did a buyout I took in consideration their circumstances. So the first one, she was incarcerated due to setting my house on fire, and so I said, hey, here's $500, take it or leave it. Honestly, that buyout was I was really frustrated and upset, but I was like, here's $500, take it or leave it. And because she was incarcerated, she took it joyfully. The second tenant, I offered $1,500, and then I also said I'd pay for moving expenses. Like I said, the landlord I mentioned, I know for one of his tenants, he bought them out for $25,000. So when usually people talk about buying out cash for key situation, they usually are thinking it has to be $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 plus dollars. It doesn't have to necessarily be that. Just have your number in mind, and then also get creative too, because there's other things that a tenant may want. Like moving expenses can be expensive, so that might actually be a huge incentive than just throwing cash at them to buy them out. All right, the third step: start negotiation. And don't just come out and be like, hey, here's this money, will you leave, right? First off, I highly recommend any type of negotiation be done in person, face to face. it could be over the phone if you're a long distance tenant. If you have a property manager, I highly suggest and you're a small landlord, I highly suggest you do it yourself, and don't pass this on to a property manager, because at the end of the day, it's going to fall on you, right? Like if you do have to move forward with the eviction process. So do it in person. Don't do it over the phone. The tenant might record you, but again, we've built good rapport with them. We've been on good terms with them, right? We're on good terms with them now, so there should be no inclination for them to record you, but just move smart about the situation. So when I negotiated, I'll tell you, I stopped by the property one time, and I was dropping in, and I was like, hey, how are you doing? How are your kids doing? Again, and I always want to tell people, remember that your tenants are people, right? I know a lot of investors, landlords get caught up in like, I have this many doors and that many doors, and they forget that behind those doors are actually people. So have that human touch to the negotiation process. So during one of my drop-ins to the property, I was like, hey, we're again talking, catching up, and I was like, hey, so, what about like $1,500 and I'll pay for moving expenses? And he was like, oh, yeah, and then I actually think that number was a lot for him, the face he made. And I was like, crap, I could have started at 1,000, but whatever. In my mind, my high was like 25. I was willing to part with $2,500, right? So $1,500, I was like, hey, fine. He was like, oh, that could work. But this is another thing with the negotiation. Be firm on when the tenant needs to let you know by. You do not want to just have that hanging out there like, oh yeah, will you essentially leave? You're not going to say it like this, for X amount of money. Get back to me when you get back to me. Don't do that, because what could happen is your tenant could end up talking to friends or family. They get a bug in their ear and they're like, oh, they're only going to give you $1,500. You can get $8,000. Like, you do not want that to happen. So I think I told him like $1,500, I'll pay for moving expenses, but you have to let me know by like the end of the week. Like, I was put like a firm deadline on it, and I said it really firmly. And he was like, yeah, I'll let you know. And sure enough, he let me know before the end of the week. He said he'll take it. All right. And moving to the fourth step. The fourth step is have a really tight termination of lease contract. Have a really tight contract. Now, I could do a whole separate video on some like must-have provisions. Granted, a termination of lease, like depending on the state you live in, right, the property's in, you want to be mindful of any tenant-landlord laws that may like dictate what terms you would want to put in there. But generally speaking, one provision that is like a must-have and something to keep in mind during this whole process, this is not an offer for them to leave. This is not an offer from you, the landlord, to the tenant to leave. If anything, this is an offer of the tenant. The tenant is making you an offer to, hey, if you give me money, I will leave, right? And why that's so important, right? You don't want it to be like, landlord, I'm making you, tenant, an offer. If you leave, I will give you this money. Why that's important is if you do end up having to still go the eviction route, you do not want, I don't know what state you're in. I don't know your state laws, but I'll tell you something, especially in the tenant-friendly states, tenant-landlord judges, I've had to deal with them. I had to go through an eviction process. They do not look fondly, like anything that they can like dock a landlord for, they will do it. Landlords are looked at like, I don't care how much money you have, they automatically assume landlords have money, and it's like, oh, the poor tenant, not literally poor, like, oh, so just be mindful of this is not an offer. This is the tenant making an offer from the tenant to you to leave. So just be really mindful. And that's a really crucial line you want to have in your contract that says something along those lines, right? And the last and final step is do not give the tenant money until you have the keys in your hand. That's why they call it cash for keys. It really should be called keys for cash. Give me the keys and then I'll give you the cash. But make sure the tenant has signed your termination of lease, The door is literally closed. It's empty. There's nothing left. There's literally nothing left in the unit. And you have the keys, you have your mailbox keys, you have everything from the tenant in your hand. And then you are giving the tenant the cash on the move out date. You want this to be a one swift transaction on the day that they are set to move out, which that date should be in your termination lease. All right, those are my 5 steps to buy out a tenant, aka cash for keys, particularly if you're in a tenant-friendly state. Let me know if you have any questions or any comments in the comment section.